So now we're going to have all of the panelists join us on screen, and we're going to take audience questions. So the first question that I have for you is people were asking, how did cannabis come to America? Does anyone?
Yeah, I'll take that. It's a great question, and it's one, there are answers that several people are certain of, and they conflict. So one theory is that cannabis came to the Americas with what are called the Mound people. It came across the Bering Straits about 2,500 years ago with people who settled in the central part of this country, in the Mississippi Valley and Ohio. And there's some archaeological evidence to support that theory. There's some residues that have been identified as cannabis in the Mound people archaeological sites. Another theory is that the Vikings actually were responsible for bringing cannabis to the Americas. We know the Vikings used hemp for their sails, for their ropes, for their clothing. So that's another theory. And the Vikings, of course, would predate the European colonizers. And then yet the other theory, which I believe Travis mentioned, is the theory that it is actually an old world plant that came with the colonizers. And that was the first time it came into the Americas. In fact, I heard one statement, which is somewhat amusing, but it was a Lakota person who said cannabis was the only good thing the white man brought with him. And so maybe that's true as well. And so I think the answer is nobody knows, but we do know that cannabis quickly found acceptance throughout the Americas, not just in what's currently the United States territory, but in Mexico. There's several indigenous communities that have woven cannabis into their religious and spiritual traditions, and the same thing in South America. And so the notion was that some of the reason it came with the colonizers wasn't just to grow hemp for its utilitarian purpose, but that as part of the slave trade, the cannabis came with some of the African peoples who were brought here against their will and brought their most important plants. And so I think the answer is nobody knows, but there's a lot of darn good theories out there. And clearly it's taken root literally in this country.
I have a couple things I'd like to add to that. One is when talking about like the history of colonization and the period of history between 1885 and 1985. It's not that long, and it's really interesting, like all the how fast modernization took effect in that time frame. So from 1885 to the 1913s, when we go into World War I, then the 20s we go into World War II. During that time frame, here in Oklahoma is where the last pandemic was, the Spanish flu, and they were saying it happened in Oklahoma-Kansas border, and oddly enough, the first two places hit were Black Wall Street and Concho, Oklahoma, the Cheyenne Reservation. For the longest time, they were blaming it on world travel. They were saying it was due to global travel, and that's how those types of diseases and things made it over here and spread the way they did. And so an interesting thing, like I study cannabis genetics quite a bit. And like I said, it's not that, it doesn't go that far back. 1920s, it's, 100 years worth of history when cannabis versus hemp were kind of moving around in the Americas. And an interesting thing about the way cannabis genetics have developed is that if you track the movement of the US military, you kind of notice that things about cannabis, changes that happened in cannabis were happening when the military was traveling to different parts. In the 90s was a big thing. There's a big thing about skunk, cannabis skunk. There's a skunk revitalization right now. People are talking about how the Prohibition era ruined American cannabis because they had to do things like breed the smell out of it or breed them so that they were smaller plants that could be grown indoors. They said the Prohibition era ruined it, and prior to that, prior to that, we just have a different genetic stock. And what was in America, it's the activity of American cannabis was biggest between the 1920s and the 1990s. Prior to that, you have the hippie trail overseas when people from the European countries were traveling to where cannabis originates from. There's actually a big movement right now, a big skunk movement where people are reintroducing cannabis from the hippie trail era and kind of dogging American genetics because just guys, whatever. And I know some of the, I know one of the players from the European side. And it's really fascinating. The genetics that are being reintroduced are kind of blowing away modern strains. Prohibition era strains are just weak. And a lot of people have made money off of these modern strains, and it's a big thing. It's kind of a big thing. These people who are re-releasing strains older than the American strains, they're getting flack, they're getting suppressed, they're being hated on, they're being dogged out. Americans don't want people to believe that there's anything better than what America produced. But anyways, that's my little bit on cannabis history.
I've got a little bit too. So yeah, I mean there are a bunch of theories on it, and there's no way to know 100% exactly where it's at. There are a bunch of people doing like forensic ethnobotany and genealogy and kind of tracing things back. And there's some theories that say that it's over 12,000 years old, and it comes from the original seeds and genetics come from like the Middle Eastern territory, and it's like found its way essentially along the Silk Road, right? And then around the east and then west coasts of Africa down through South Africa, and essentially over into the U.S. with Portuguese and British imperialism, for trace the military, right? Even before the American military, with the movement of the military, the plants were coming along. So, for sure, I believe that, because any plant 12,000 years old, like a ginkgo tree, or, any plant that's been on the planet for that long, and it has thousands of years of use, people were braiding it in their hair and bringing it over as like other essential plants were brought over, with people who were earth-faring, got on boats and knew they were going to end up somewhere mysterious. They came with the foods and the medicines that sustained them. So I think, there's for sure, people who migrated, whether they came through the Bering Strait or they came over on ships, knew, how to work with medicines. And, the folks who were cultivating in that way were not doing monoculture fields. So, the presence of it would look very different for people who are working with it medicinally. It might be, intercropped within, other medicines in the forest, the mugwort and your mullein, your cattails, right? All this stuff is kind of working together. Maybe not cattails, it's a little wet, but other things that are relevant. And then you have, the plantation style cultivation for, industrial use. And, two very different contexts of, one, the cultivar, and then two, its production and how it's being bred for that land use. And then you have a complete divergence in, what's prioritized in the gene selection. So, yeah, there's a cool little graphic about that. I don't know if I could show it to y'all if we have enough time for that. Is that okay? I can just do it for like 2 seconds. Can I show a little graphic of like a map in the timeline for that, Nicole?
Yeah, I have to make you a co-host, so I think you can share your screen.
Okay, I think it shows it now. All right. Okay, hang on. Yeah, so just, it's anecdotal, and this is, based on, some ethnobotanic, ethnobotany studies and geographical study of cannabis history. So, you get a sense of, oh, so yeah, the origin in like the Tibetan region, really. Like the Mongols are given credit for cultivating it, working with it most closely. And then as you see, a whole bunch of movement, you know, before Jesus, and then well into right now. So.
I think we could do a whole topic on land race and the ethnobotany of cannabis. It's super fascinating, and I think a lot of people that consume it would be quite surprised to learn so much about the difference between a cultivar and a strain, and the different terpenes and what it all means. So I'm going to continue asking you guys questions that have been submitted because I want to get to our audience questions. Although I would love to hear more about how to raise cannabis like an Indian child if we have time to get to it. That's also very interesting. Okay, but here's another question from our audience. Cannabis and community gardens in New York City. When the 18 months pass, I think speaking about when it becomes legal for recreational grow, will folks who only have access to land via community gardens be able to grow in said gardens? This is definitely something that we're discussing in New York Small Farma, so I can also weigh in on this. I'm going to be interested to hear, from maybe the New Yorkers about growing in community gardens of New York.
Yeah, I'll just say nobody knows, but if we have anything to do with it, yes, absolutely yes. This is a big unknown in terms of the regulatory environment and what will happen. In New York, we actually have to get the regulatory framework established, which seems to be taking quite a long time. The law was passed on March 31st, and we have yet to get the vital infrastructure established, the Office of Cannabis Management and the Cannabis Control Board, because quite frankly, it's a New York type thing where they just can't really agree. They probably couldn't agree. Today's Wednesday. But yes, that is a great question, and it's something that we would love to see happen. And I think not only community gardens, but really creating opportunities so this does not become endeavor that is only available to those people who have land. So really creating those opportunities.
Can I jump in on that, Donna? So yeah, thank you for that. I think that's important. Yet we don't know, and there's a whole bunch of things to consider. There's going to be like zoning considerations, like whether the garden itself is the only area, if it's like a non-licensed thing, and if you were to do it indoors, is it still the same amount of plants if you like the yard and indoors mixed together, one address? So there's lots of details that need to be shaped. One of the things that we're doing with New York City-based grows is looking to utilize indoor spaces so that we can leverage the lack of land access for the communities that live, in environments like this. Very few of us can afford $2 million real estate prices to, have a backyard even, or to just have a vacant lot that we own, because once we have cannabis growing there on any sort of professional scale, it needs to be protected. I don't know, barbed wire, fencing, things like that all become issues. So we're looking to address that by moving things indoors, because it's going to be necessary as people desire to cultivate here, but do that in a way that honors, the tenets of regenerative and indigenous agriculture, which is to not use more than we need, and to replace everything we take, and to build the soil fundamentally. So yeah, if this conversation could go on for a long time. I can't believe we've gone through an hour of it already. But if anybody wants to discuss any more of this with me, I'm super excited to do so. So please, I think my email is placed in there, and our site's there. The site does not talk about cannabis because it's just about urban ag and accessible agriculture in that context. But it includes that. Just for this, we have to separate the legal things.
So I do want to get, is it okay if we just take one more question before we go? And I just wanted to add, like, one of the things that we are exploring at NY Small Farma, although we recognize that there, you know, we of course really want to promote outdoor grow so that we can have not only no carbons being emitted, but that we're sequestering carbons and that we have food for pollinators and just creating the right ecological environment for the plants and for the ecology around us. But, you know, one of the things we want to really look at is rooftop gardens, planting not only cannabis, but planting vegetables, planting fruits, planting plants that capture pollutants in the air, where there are plenty of those plants that can clean the air. And so I agree, we don't want to see a city covered in barbed wire, but there are a lot of creative solutions that we have yet to come up with as well. So the next question I'd like to ask you guys are, what are your thoughts on legacy, which is the unlicensed market, and the exchange and cultivation of cannabis outside of legal channels? And I can't speak for this person, but maybe what the question is asking is that there are legacy markets that are considering maintaining legacy operation, and understandably so. That's the question. What are your thoughts on legacy / underground markets and the exchange and cultivation of cannabis outside of legal channels? I also have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I've got a lot to say there. I think it's a really important platform to stand on, and you know, it requires probably the biggest bullhorn within the conversation about cannabis legalization, because you know, the fact of the matter is the entire schematic for the cannabis industry is following the legacy operations. You know, the commodification, the pricing, the customer pipeline, you know, what customers enjoy, has all been figured out by legacy operators. And now we have a scenario where, you know, you're essentially criminalized if you cannot afford either like the resources and the capital upstart to become, you know, a licensed farm, right? How much capital are we talking about? 100,000 for a license, $500,000, $2 million for facility, et cetera, et cetera. So you're still illegal if you can't afford to be legal, and this becomes, you know, a privilege and, you know, class, and essentially, you know, by percentage, a race issue. So, you know, I think that, you know, it's a complicated thing because we know that this is happening for tax dollars, but for sure, like, you know, the allowances, you know, provided for, you know, sovereignty provided for indigenous people, there needs to be some framework for legacy operations that functions similarly, because, you know, we're essentially displacing those operators and gentrifying the marketplace with you know, people who have capital resources. And I don't have an answer further than that, but it's, you know, probably one of the things that I'm most passionate about in this transition.
I think I just will add real briefly to that. I think you're absolutely right, SirRoan, and it's something that we have been very cognizant of. I've personally spoken to a lot of, a bunch of different people in the unlicensed legacy market, we'll call it, who want to become legal. They prefer to become legal. They have families. They do not want to be underground anymore, but there has to be that pathway. And this is another one of the sticky, tricky areas that's going to have to be worked out in the regulations. And I do hope we have the framework in New York and that we are able to make good on it and bring this into the conversation. One of the hooks, I know this webinar isn't really about law, but one of the hooks, quite frankly, to regulators and lawmakers is, if you don't let these people in, they will continue operating and you will not get your tax revenue. And so I think that really is an important hook. And I was very encouraged to, there is funding available in the New York state law for startup businesses, and I believe there is funding in the law that was just the draft law that was introduced today by Senators Schumer, Booker, and Wyden. And so I think this is something that was also going to require a big push. I would like to, if we do have a minute more, I would love to hear what Travis has to say about raising the child, because I'm very curious. You know, I have several children, I have several grandchildren, and I would love to hear what it is, what is the way that you raise those children?
Okay, man, I'd love to talk about this. Okay, so Korean natural farming and JADAM are two systems developed by a father and a son in Korea. And JADAM actually means people reflected by nature. Beautiful concept, and like what we was talking about, people don't grow in boxes, and we don't grow under artificial light. It's better outside and natural. So, you know, we were talking about the Prohibition era. Plants were bred to take synthetic nutrients and to take artificial light, and different things like that. They were bred away from being a plant. And so we've been growing and kind of going against the grain, and not treating our plants like closet queens, but treating them like plants. I don't know. Some people really shelter their kids and won't let them, you know, fall on the ground or, you know, eat dirt or whatever. But over here we do a lot of that. You know, these are indigenous plants. People were blown away that last year I was letting my plants go into the snowing season. I was waiting for the frost to hit them. I wanted to see what would happen. In regards to harvesting other types of medicines and fruits and whatnot, a lot of times you let the frost hit them because it changes the flavor. It does a lot of wonderful things to it. People were just blown away. They're like, "Oh my gosh, you know, you're treating your cannabis like a weed, you know, like, you know, but they're growing amazing. I don't get how that works." You know, and you know. So in regards to how they are fed, you know, I like to start out by talking about something called air pruning, and where they use bags instead of pots, instead of plastic pots. And what's neat about it is when you go to transplant and you remove the bag, there's no roots. They call it air pruning because when the roots are exposed to the air, they kind of pull back. So what this does is, when you remove the pot, you don't have long stringy roots. Instead, you have a real solid, robust root mass. What this reflects is in Cree, we have moss bags. They're beaded bags. They make your babies look like glowworms, you know, like caterpillars. They little snuggle bunny things. And traditionally, they put peat moss in there. And peat moss was preferred because it's antibacterial. Children who were put in moss bags were less prone to diaper rash. You know, and so from that neat fact, seedlings can be fed diluted breast milk. Breast milk contains all the nutrients and enzymes, everything needed for new life and for easy digestion. So plants can actually be fed diluted breast milk. And then if you look at the composition of what breast milk is, you know, now that I make a lot of compost teas and different things, I actually try to recreate breast milk. You know, it's like 68% carbohydrates, 2% ash, 2% salt content. And that stuff's really easy to recreate. And so, you know, we try to recreate breast milk. And the trick to that is fermentation. And all fermentation is pre-digesting foods. And fermentation, Korean natural farming is promoted using brown sugar, but sugar is hard to get, and people don't know it, but this same thing can be done with rock salt. Fermentation can be done with rock salt. So with that, what we do is we ferment specific foods for specific nutritional qualities and values. We hunt down specific growth hormones, things like that. A really interesting thing about the way cannabis grows is you can feed flowering cannabis fruits, because those fruits are essentially, you know, all the magnesium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all those things compiled into, you know, a fruit that's medicine. And we break it down by way of fermentation, make it water soluble, and it can be fed back to plants. So how it works is like young plants can be fed sprout tea. Seed sprout tea contains growth hormones it contains rooting hormones. So you can feed young plants seed sprout water. And as they get bigger, you can feed them leafy greens. And an important part is they need a lot of carbohydrates. It's really weird. They need a lot of amino acids because amino acids break down proteins. So we hunt a lot of foods that are high in amino acids. And right now the number one is soy. And big ag in America uses soy products, fermented soy products. It's a big thing. And us small farmers are just getting to know about it. It's a huge thing. And if you can't use soy, the next best option is corn. And if you look for the best soy products out there, they're usually hit with a corn product, a corn additive. And it's probably just corn starch because that's an anti-caking agent. Aside from that, we also break down fish, and all we're sourcing is amino acids. We can ferment fish with brown sugar and produce fish amino acids. We combine that with the fermented soy or corn and different things. And we're just trying to compound as much amino acids as we can to break down the proteins and release all the nutrients. So fermentation is one way of releasing nutrients from foods and grains. And the other is nixtamalization. Nixtamalization is something really important. And nixtamalization, corn over here is the equivalent of soy over there, which is really interesting. And corn over here, when it was taken overseas and people tried to eat it like we did over here, they got sick. And if you try to eat soy over here like they do over there, they say you'll get sick. And what people don't know is that pretty much all grains contain self-defense mechanisms to prevent them from being digested. Because once they're digested, they can no longer reproduce. So grains contain self-defense mechanisms. And beans are a perfect example. When you eat a bean, it doesn't want to be digested, so it produces a gas. All grains have these qualities, and you treat them with nixtamalization. It has a lot of different names, but Asians use gypsum, Mexicans use volcanic ash, and American Indians, we use softwood ash, all for the same purpose. And once you learn how to convert and release the nutrients in grains, then you start compounding how to ferment a plant. Because not all of it ferments the same way. Leaves don't ferment the same way as stalks and roots. So there's multiple methods to it, but it's just basic distillation. And so essentially what we're learning how to do is hunt specific nutrients and break them down, render them water soluble, and how to administer them. And we do so in a balanced manner. And so what's funny is once we start looking at what we're feeding and how we're feeding it, you start to realize these are our traditional foods and we're supposed to be eating these. We're supposed to be eating like this. And so yeah, that's kind of my little bit on, feeding cannabis like an Indian child and upwards. That's it.
Thank you.
That's a really great diet.
I like it. And so we do these, and I've been trying to promote this, to Indian groups out there. I feel confident that if there's any groups out there that are growing, maybe struggling, I feel I could offer consultation to help improve things. I'm looking to get involved with groups out there that are growing any way possible.
Thank you. We'll be sure to come back to you when we start our grow school.
Yeah, for sure.
So unfortunately, it's super interesting conversation, and we scratched the surface yet again of many very interesting things, but I think we have to draw the evening to a close. It's 7:43. But I thank everyone for their time, and I thank all of you for attending and for viewing and for submitting the questions. And I know that some people have asked for extra information on the topics that Travis and SirRoan were presenting, and we will do our best to get those to you and get them posted on our website and in our newsletter. If you're not signed up with our newsletter, please do so. And please consider contributing to New York Small Farma or to SirRoan's organization or to Travis's work. And then please also reach out to them as well. So we thank everyone for attending and for being here. And we definitely thank our panelists for their insights this evening. For all of us at New York Small Farma and on this panel, we wish everyone a good night.